I never imagined I'd find myself here, caught in the web of my own desires, teetering on the edge of betrayal with someone I should never have touched. But the heart is a treacherous thing, leading you down paths you swore you'd never take, until you're lost in the maze of your own making. This is the story of how I betrayed not just someone I love, but myself as well. How I fell into an affair with my best friend's husband, a man I should have seen only as family, and how that single choice unraveled everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and myself. Jess and I had been best friends since college. We bonded over shared classes, late-night study sessions, and a mutual love for bad romantic comedies. She was the kind of friend who was always there when you needed her, the one who would drop everything to help you out. When she met Chris, I was genuinely happy for her. He was charming, funny, and utterly devoted to her. They seemed perfect together, and when they got married a few years later, I was her maid of honor, standing by her side as she started this new chapter of her life. Little did I know that I would be the one to tear that chapter apart. I was married too, to a man named Ethan. Our relationship had always been stable, if not particularly passionate. We were partners in every sense of the word, supporting each other through the ups and downs of life. But somewhere along the way, the spark that had once ignited our love had faded. We were comfortable, but comfort isn't always enough. I found myself yearning for something more, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Chris and Jess lived just a few streets over from us, and we often spent time together, dinners, movie nights, weekends away. The four of us were close, almost like family, and I cherished the bond we all shared. But somewhere along the way, things began to change between Chris and me. It was subtle at first, little moments of connection, shared glances, a touch that lingered just a second too long. I didn't think much of it at the time, brushing it off as harmless, but those moments began to add up, until I found myself thinking about Chris in ways I knew I shouldn't. It all came to a head one evening when Ethan was out of town on business. Jess had gone to visit her parents for the weekend, leaving Chris alone. He invited me over for dinner, saying he didn't feel like eating alone, and I agreed, not thinking anything of it. We had dinner together, talked about life, about work, about everything and nothing. It was easy, comfortable, just like it always was between us. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to change. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken but palpable, and I could feel it pulling us closer together. After dinner, we moved to the living room, and Chris poured us each a glass of wine. We sat on the couch, side by side, the distance between us shrinking with every passing moment. The conversation grew quieter, more intimate, until there was nothing left to say, only the weight of what was happening between us. "I've missed this," Chris said softly, his eyes meeting mine. "Just talking, just being here with you." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to acknowledge. This was wrong, so wrong, but I couldn't seem to stop myself from wanting more. Chris reached out and took my hand in his touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. "I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Emma. I know I shouldn't, but I can't help it." His words hit me like a ton of bricks, and I felt a rush of emotions that I couldn't begin to untangle. This was Jess's husband, my best friend's partner, and I should have pulled away, should have ended it right there. But instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, letting the warmth of his hand seep into my skin. "Chris, we can't," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of what I was saying. "This isn't right." "I know," he replied, his voice filled with regret. "But I can't stop myself. I've tried, but I want you, Emma. I've wanted you for a long time." The confession hung in the air between us, heavy and dangerous, and I felt my resolve crumbling. How had we gotten here? How had I let this happen? But even as the guilt washed over me, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. Before I knew what was happening, Chris leaned in and kissed me. It was a soft, tentative kiss, as if he was giving me a chance to pull away, to stop this before it went any further. But I didn't. I couldn't. The moment our lips met, it was like a dam breaking, releasing all the emotions I had been trying so hard to suppress. I kissed him back with a desperation that surprised even me, and when he deepened the kiss, I felt myself falling, tumbling headfirst into something I knew I shouldn't want but couldn't resist. We broke apart, both of us breathing heavily, our foreheads resting together as we tried to process what had just happened. "We can't do this," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We can't." "I know," Chris replied, his voice filled with regret. "But I can't stop myself. I want you, Emma. And I know you feel the same." His words sent a thrill through me, but it was quickly followed by a wave of guilt so intense it nearly took my breath away. This was my best friend's husband, the man she loved, the man she trusted. How could I do this to her? How could I betray her like this? But even as the guilt gnawed at me, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward Chris, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was wrong, so wrong, but the temptation was overwhelming, and I found myself unable to resist. "We have to be careful," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "No one can ever know about this." Chris nodded, his thumbs gently brushing away the tears that had begun to fall from my eyes. "I promise," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "This stays between us." That night, we crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. We spent hours together, tangled in each other's arms, exploring the depths of our desire, our passion. It was intoxicating, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. And when it was over, when we lay together in the aftermath of what we had done, the reality of our betrayal began to sink in. "This can't happen again," I said softly, my voice filled with a mixture of regret and longing. "We can't keep doing this." Chris sighed, his fingers tracing patterns on my skin. "I know," he replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I don't know if I can stay away from you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a pang of guilt so intense it nearly brought me to tears. How had we let things get this far? How had I allowed myself to betray Jess, the person who had always been there for me, who trusted me completely? "We have to try," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We have to." The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I had to see Jess, had to look her in the eye and pretend that everything was normal, that I wasn't hiding a terrible secret that would destroy her if she ever found out. Every time I saw her, the guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder of the line I had crossed, the betrayal I had committed. Chris and I tried to keep our distance, tried to go back to the way things were before that night. But it was impossible. The attraction between us was too strong, the connection too deep. We kept finding ourselves drawn back together, meeting in secret, stealing moments whenever we could. It was a dangerous game, one that I knew could only end in heartbreak, but I couldn't stop myself. I was addicted to the way he made me feel, to the thrill of the forbidden. And then, one day, everything came crashing down. Jess had planned a weekend getaway for the four of us, just a few days at a cabin in the mountains, a chance to relax and unwind. I knew it was a bad idea, but I couldn't say no without raising suspicion. The thought of being in such close quarters with Chris, with no escape from the tension that had been building between us, filled me with dread. But I couldn't back out. Jess was so excited about the trip, and the last thing I wanted was to disappoint her. So, I went along with it, trying to convince myself that I could keep my feelings in check, that I could get through the weekend without giving anything away. The first day was uneventful. We hiked, we cooked dinner together, and in the evening, we sat by the fire, talking and laughing as if everything was normal. But I could feel the tension between Chris and me, an invisible thread pulling us together even as we tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. Every time our eyes met, my heart would race, and I had to force myself to look away, to focus on anything other than the man sitting just a few feet away from me. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself unable to sleep. The guilt, the anxiety, the fear of being caught, it all weighed heavily on my mind. I tossed and turned, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but it was no use. Finally, I got out of bed and quietly made my way downstairs to the kitchen, hoping that a glass of water would help. As I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out into the dark woods beyond the cabin, I heard footsteps behind me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I turned to see Chris standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't sleep," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Me neither," I replied, my voice trembling. The air between us was thick with tension, with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. He took a step closer, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same turmoil that was raging inside me. "We need to talk," he said softly, his gaze intense. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. We needed to figure out what we were doing, what this meant, and how we could move forward without destroying everything in our path. But before either of us could say another word, the kitchen light flicked on, and there stood Jess, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. She looked between Chris and me, her expression quickly shifting from surprise to something much darker. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Panic surged through me, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I couldn't think, couldn't find the words to explain, to lie, to do anything but stand there frozen in place. Chris stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation, but it was too late. Jess had seen the look in our eyes, the way we had been standing too close, the tension that had been simmering between us for weeks. "Emma, what the hell is going on?" Jess repeated, her voice rising as she took a step closer, her eyes locked onto mine. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth was there, hanging in the air between us, and I knew there was no way to take it back, no way to undo the damage that had already been done. Jess's face twisted with anger and betrayal, and she turned to Chris, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "Tell me the truth, Chris. Have you been sneaking around with my best friend?" Chris's face went pale, and I could see the panic in his eyes as he struggled to find the right words. "Jess, it's not what you think," he began, but she cut him off with a sharp, bitter laugh. "Not what I think," she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Then what is it, Chris? Because it looks a hell of a lot like you've been cheating on me with my own best friend." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. This was it, this was the moment everything fell apart. "Jess, please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted any of this to happen." She stared at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and pain. "How could you do this to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You're my best friend, Emma. I trusted you. I trusted both of you." Chris tried to reach out to her, but she recoiled, shaking her head as tears streamed down her face. "Don't touch me," she spat. "Don't ever touch me again." She turned and ran from the kitchen, leaving Chris and me standing there in the aftermath of our betrayal, the reality of what we had done crashing down around us. "I'm so sorry," Chris said softly, his voice filled with regret. "I never meant for this to happen." But his words did little to ease the guilt that was suffocating me. We had crossed a line we never should have crossed, had destroyed the trust of the person who had meant the most to us. And now, we were left to pick up the pieces of the lives we had shattered. The rest of the weekend was a blur of tension and silence. Jess avoided us both, spending most of her time outside, refusing to engage in any conversation. The drive back home was equally unbearable. The comfortable, easy camaraderie that had once existed between us was gone, replaced by a strained, uncomfortable silence. When we returned to the city, the aftermath of our actions continued to unfold. Jess filed for divorce within weeks, cutting off all contact with both Chris and me. She couldn't bear to be in the same room with either of us, and I couldn't blame her. The friendship we had once shared, the bond that had been so strong, was gone, replaced by a gaping wound that would never fully heal. As for Chris and me, the passion that had once consumed us quickly turned to ashes in the wake of the destruction we had caused. We tried to make it work, tried to find solace in each other, but it was no use. The guilt, the shame, the constant reminders of what we had done, it was too much to bear. We drifted apart, each of us lost in our own grief and regret. Ethan was devastated when he found out the truth. He tried to understand, tried to forgive me, but in the end, he couldn't look past the betrayal. Our marriage crumbled under the weight of my infidelity, and we parted ways, the life we had built together reduced to memories and regrets. In the end, I was left alone, haunted by the choices I had made, by the people I had hurt, by the life I had destroyed. The spark that had once drawn me to Chris, that had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, had turned into a raging fire that consumed everything in its path. And now, all I had left were the ashes, the remnants of a life that would never be the same again.